So we're going to be going over Philippians, chapter 1. We're going to be in 12, and we're going to go to 18. So that's where we're going to be hanging out. It ends like this. It says, I rejoice, yes, and I will continue to rejoice. I really like this verse. When I read the 7 verses prior to it, it is the one that speaks so loud because he rejoices throughout all that is in these verses. And throughout Philippians, he hears this. So it's a great way for Paul to end this section and transition into the next. Paul talks throughout this letter about rejoicing despite so much. Despite being in jail, not where he wanted to be, by the way. Despite other Christians being jealous or rivals in making it hard for him. And how can we have this? How can we have this joy? And how can he do this? So it's because the gospel is being proclaimed and Jesus is being preached. Believers are being strengthened, built up, and are more bold because of it. Paul has hard times, but encouraged so many because of his perseverance through it. Even us today. So, when we look at Philippians, we'll be reading through the verses 12 to 18. And Paul's the author of this letter. So, Paul is one of my favorite guys in the Bible. He read a lot of the New Testament. One of my first sermons I did was about Paul. I really enjoy him. I think he's an awesome guy. And he was a guy that was preached not only to the Jews, but also the Gentiles. He tells us loads of times that he was called to preach in different places, to different people, to the Gentiles that weren't the God's chosen of the Old Testament. And I believe that's also what it'll be for us. I believe that we'll be called to places like South America, Central America, Europe, Asia, Africa, or the hardest place, North America. I know that there are people here right now that have been called to different places and will eventually go. So, when we look back at where Paul was called and preached to the different gospels after preaching to the Jews, I wanted to just take a little look at Romans before I get into Philippians. I promise I'll get there. I'll just give everybody loads of time to get there. So in Romans 15, 23 to 24, this is what it says. And this is Paul writing again. He says, but now there is no more places for me to work in these regions. And since I have been longing for so many years to visit you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. So he wanted to go to Spain, and sometimes we're called to places, and he believes that God's called him there. But he goes to Jerusalem first, and we don't even know if he makes it to Spain, which is very interesting, because we could feel that we're getting called to places, but if there's a place that he's called before that, then you go there first. So he writes to Roman, and he did move around a lot, but this is kind of what I wanted to start with when we get into Philippians 1, 12 to 18, a guy that is called to move. So, Philippians 1, 12 to 18, it goes like this. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else, I am in chains chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of my brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true, some preach out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am here in the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is, in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. So I'm going to break this up into 2 different parts. We're going to go over 12 to 14, and then we're going to go over 15 to 18. I think that is a good way to look at it. So it starts with, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me actually served to advance the gospel. So I think this begs the question, what happened to him? prior to this that is advancing the gospel? Well, I wanted to start where he got arrested because he's in jail when he's writing this. So now we know Paul got arrested quite a few times. He's got arrested at least 3 times. And when he wrote this letter, he was in Rome. So he's in Rome. And when he's writing, it was towards the end of end of his life. But we're going to go look at the book of Acts to kind of get an overview of what happened, to find out where he is. Because he says, now brothers and sisters, I want you to know what happened to me, advance the gospel. So, this is what Luke says in Acts. And it happens from chapter 21 to 28. So I'm not going to read the 7 chapters that are there because that is a lot of chapters. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the beginning of it. I'm going to look at how he got arrested and what happened. And if you guys are interested in how he eventually got to Rome, that's where the whole story unfolds. So, full version 21 to 28 in Acts. But it starts with Paul getting called to Jerusalem, which is not in Rome. And how does this happen? How does God call him there? So one of the believers grabs him by the belt and he says, and he prophesies that whoever has this belt goes to Jerusalem will get arrested. Okay, so he's like, I'm going to Jerusalem. And they're very sad about this. They're weeping. And he goes, stop your crying. I'm going. God called me. And he goes. So he's in Jerusalem and what would Paul be doing in Jerusalem? Well, he's preaching naturally. He's preaching in the temples. So now this is where he gets arrested. So he's in there. He preaches for 7 days. And then the leaders of the temples see him with Gentiles. So that's people that are not Jews. And they assume that he took them into the temple and they don't even know that for sure. It says they think that's what happened. So they think he broke one of the laws. So now Paul was in the temple, and then the leaders get an angry mob, and they want to go kill Paul. So they grab Paul, and this mob starts beating him. And it's not like a casual beating. It's like, I want to beat you to death type of beating. So this riot's going on, and the Roman guards hear about it. So Romans don't like riots. They're expensive, they're dangerous, and generally just unhelpful. So they run down, see what's happening, they see the commotion, and they go to stop it. And Paul getting beat up, and then the Romans need to arrest someone for all this commotion. So who do they arrest? Well, naturally, the guy that's getting beat up. So they arrest Paul. Like, seriously, no. Isn't that crazy? Like, one is getting beat up is the one that gets arrested. So if you're Paul, what would you do? I'm like, I could tell you, I wouldn't be too thrilled about the whole experience. So you're preaching, and you're preaching for 7 days here. And these guys riot, they go and beat you up, arrest you. So what does Paul do? This is very interesting. He's like, to the Romans, he's like, guys, I need to speak to the crowd, the guys that were just beating me up. And this is the crazy part. The Roman commander says, yeah, okay, sure. So he proceeds to start telling his testimony about how God saved him. So he says, I was trained in the Jewish laws and customs. He was a very zealous man that was after God's heart, and he was like, this is how God came to me. He spoke to me in the word, and a big light came down, boom, started talking to me. And I went after the Christians before this. I was the ones I was going after them, and I would take both men and women to jail. I was like you guys. Then he tells them about how he's saved. But then he says he was called to preach to the Gentiles. And it's only so they hear all this testimony, they don't go crazy, but as soon as that happens, then they come after him. The crowd goes crazy, go to get him again. Now the commander's not happy because he let him talk to these guys. They started another riot, and then he's like, okay, we're going to get this guy, and we're going to beat him and interrogate him. And it's like, let's just pause for a moment. If I'm telling my testimony in front of a crowd, I'm not arrested or tortured for doing it. The consequences of telling how I found Jesus is a lot different. Luckily for Paul, he was a Roman citizen. So he goes, how is it possible that a Roman citizen hasn't been found guilty yet, is going to get tortured and beat for it? And so the Romans were kinder to them, so they hold back. So they don't, but they still arrest him. They end up taking him. He ends up going on a big journey. He goes from Jerusalem and ends up in Rome. And this is not an easy journey, to say the least. There's lots of trials, and you can take a peek at it when you look at the chapters, Acts 21 to 28. But that's what he means by what he says what happened to me actually served to advance the gospel. He's writing to the Philippians from jail from that arrest. So, I just want to do a quick summary. It goes like this. So, he gets called to Jerusalem. God calls him. People say don't go. He's arrested. He preaches, teaches for 7 days, suspected of teaching the Gentiles, not even proven. Gets beaten up, arrested, and is like, hold up, I have a testimony. Says it. Threatened to be killed, prevented, threatened to be beaten, prevented, then put in jail, ends up in a Roman jail after a number of trials. Not an easy road to get there. And he says all this is actually to serve the gospel. So I like to always just think about this in kind of modern terms to show how crazy it is, because sometimes when you're looking at it, it's like, well, that was then. But I mean, let's look at what happened. Like, let's say if this happens to Brian. So Paul and Brian would be close to the same age as then. Brian goes to another church and he starts preaching. And he sees some street people and he says, you know what, let's bring them into the church. And then the people there get all angry, start beating him. Then the cops come up, stop it, arrest him. And it's like, holy moly. So when you think about it, it's just crazy. We would be hiring lawyers to be suing for this. We would be suing, we'd be protesting. Like, that's what happened. And I think this is kind of what the Christians probably would have been thinking like too. Like, we want to fight for this guy. And he says, you know what, this is actually to serve the gospel. It is actually okay that this happened, because people are hearing about Jesus. People are hearing about Christ. Christ is being proclaimed, and people are being built up because of this. So I just want to kind of go over that section again, and we'll kind of go through it all in Philippians. So so from 12 to 14, we're going to just take a quick look. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. When he went to jail, all the palace guard knew why he was there. He makes Christ a priority right from the start, even though he's in jail. He did what he could to preach Christ to everyone because he thought it was so important. When I think of someone, here's a question for us. Who is someone that has positively affected your belief in God? When I think of people like that, they're faithful of what God's called them to do and what God has called them for. Oftentimes, they've gone through these struggles, these different struggles. You could just look at struggles throughout people's lives, and you could see different struggles. And they come out stronger, and sometimes they're not in a great place through there, but they come out stronger, and they have more passion. And when you have someone like that, it can be very powerful for you to see that despite so much happening, they can still worship God. They can still be helpful. They could still find the joy of the Lord. And I think the prayer session was so powerful because Nathan was talking about how there is that joy that we want through the trials. So when Paul did all these things, going from Jerusalem, and he knew he would be arrested, to preaching in the temple, to preaching to the crowd, to talking to jailers, this encouraged so many, not only then, but now. Because of the chains, most of my brothers and sisters have been confident in the Lord and dare to proclaim the gospel without fear. And I think that is a very powerful statement, because there will be times where you're going through hard times and people can be watching you And you'll be like, especially in leadership, they'll say, how is this, will these guys just bend, or will they break, or will they just go back and be even more powerful? And I think how we analyze, how we react to these situations does affect so many people, and it definitely affected so many when we look at Paul. So when we think of a good evangelist, we think of people that have a perfect way of talking. Like, what they say, like say Billy Graham, he just goes up and he talks, and then boom, everybody goes up and there's a massive reaction. And that leads people to accept, loads of people to accept Jesus. And I would say Paul was a great evangelist. And sometimes it doesn't go your way. Like I would say when he got arrested for preaching. It's not like they all just accepted Jesus on the spot. He ended up having quite a different reaction to those people. But persevering through those hard times, not only to the people he was preaching to, but also to everyone else. It creates confidence and boldness in other believers. Having a church that is bold and confident in what they believe is way more powerful than one evangelist. So what does this mean for us? Well, I would say if you're going to be preaching where you might get beat to death, wear a good pair of shoes so you can run away and not get caught like Paul. Okay. That's why we dress a little casual here. That's because running in suits not easy. No, okay, no, that's not what I mean. Okay. But I'm just kidding. Okay, what does this actually mean? So when in 2022, how does this look for us? And it looks different for all of us. So I'll give you guys kind of how I would do it, because I've got my own experiences, but everybody's got a bit of a different experience. So hopefully you can relate to something I'm saying here. And we'll look at what Paul does also. So Paul pulled from his previous life without Jesus, and he used that to preach to people. So he said, I'm a Jew, I'm a very zealous one, I was very passionate about God. I was just like you guys, and he identifies them, and he goes, you know what, I was like you guys, and then I found God, and then I found Jesus and what he's done, and he tells them about his testimony. And he didn't really insult them, which when you read through it, it was very interesting. He just tells them how it happened to him. And for me, if it was for me, how I look at it is, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. So it's not like I found Jesus right away. I wasn't until I was 24. And one thing I can do is I can identify very well with the atheist community, because I was very much one when I first started. When I was in university, I very much was one. So I understand their thoughts. I understand it. I was very passionate about my beliefs then too, but there was a lot of different feeling. I was one of those guys, like these modern day fairy tale believers need some correcting, is kind of what I was like. And I remember telling my dad, I just can't wait to find a Christian, because I need to tell them how wrong they are and how to save them from their own delusions. That was me. I didn't even know any Christians, and if I did, they weren't very vocal about it. One thing I've done in the last couple of years is, if someone's asked me, or if I bring it up, that I'm a Christian, I'll tell that I was that person. And one thing I find, especially in this society, is that the Christians are painted with that they have no brains. Their brains kind of leak out when they get saved, and then it's gone. So I go, that's not the case at all. Like we strive to learn, we strive for truth, we strive for so much, and even when there's those internal frictions that may go back and forth for when you first start believing in what your old life was, we're striving for more. I hope that kind of makes sense. So it's not like we give up on it. We're not like give up on thinking and stuff like that. But it was about the experience that I had with inside that was so powerful. I didn't have joy. I found I was quite angry. I was like angrily going to tell these Christians about it. But when I really started to find joy when I started to believe. And even when I had struggles, there was a joy there. And God gave me a purpose. He gave me grace, a different destination. He gave me a community, a beautiful wife, joy, and so much more. And when you look at Paul's letters, he talks about being thankful. Like in the prayer meeting, I just want to read this verse again because I found it so applicable. It says, I thank my God every time I remember you in all my prayers for you. I pray always with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. So he was very happy with the people that were there, that were building, and that's where his joy came from. It wasn't from his money or status or where he was or living conditions. It was from the people that partnered. And when you see people here that are willing to build up and strengthen, it does bring me joy also. So I'm quite glad to have such a strong community here. So we'll pop back to Paul. So yeah, when he talks to the Jews, he talked as a Jew that used to be a Jew, but he was also a Roman citizen. And he wasn't until he didn't say he was a Roman citizen until they're like, well, we're going to beat him up. He said, okay, well, now I'm a Roman citizen. So then he identified with the Romans then too. So he was in a unique situation where he was from both those lives. And I don't think we need to make up things to identify with people in our past. There's so many things that we can identify. We all have different experiences that we can pull from. And hard times, people will see it, yeah. So, yeah, I'm sure we'll hear about it over the next few months, but he'll see, he brings up joy over and over and over again because he wants for you guys to know that even though he was in jail, that he still had joy. So that was kind of the first section. We're going to transition to the second one. Not a very good transition, but okay, 15 to 18 now. So Philippians 1, 15 to 18. So it goes like this. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am here in the defense of the gospel. For the former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? That is a very interesting statement. The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this, I rejoice. When I read these verses, the words that pop into my mind are rivalry, selfish ambition, and on the positive side, goodwill and love. And then despite all this, and what does it matter? Despite all this, Christ is being preached. It's kind of the things that pop into my mind when I read this. So I'm going to go over those two types of opposing groups, and we'll go from there. So there's the one, envy and rivalry, and then the second one is out of goodwill. One important thing on both sides is that Christ is being preached. So, from both these people groups. But I want to look at how Paul identifies people when Christ is being preached versus when Christ is not being preached. And we see a big difference in those two situations. So we'll get into the envy and rivalry, but I also wanted to look at how he identifies the two different preaching Christ and not. And when I first read this, I didn't really grasp it that as well as I feel like I have now. So that's why I think it is so important. So there's two verses that I'm going to bring up. So Philippians 3:2 and Galatians 1:6 to 10. So we're going to look at both those, especially the Galatians 1:1. But I'm going to start with the Philippians. He talks about it. He goes like this. This is what Philippians 3:2 says. He says, watch out for those dogs, those evildoers, those mutilators of the flesh. He speaks very harshly here. And why? Because people are saying you have to follow the Jewish customs to be saved. The Jewish customs that he was speaking of was that you have to be circumcised. And that is not what is required at all. That's not how you're saved. It's by faith in Jesus Christ through grace, and not by works, so no man can boast. He is correcting their theology, and he calls out the people adding things that aren't required. And he calls them dogs, evildoers, and mutilators of the flesh, not things that I would really associate with joy. In Galatians, it's even a more stark contrast. So it's a very, boom, these two are very different. So this is how it goes in Galatians 1, 6 to 10. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who calls you to live by live in the grace of Christ, and are turning to a different gospel, which really no gospel at all. Eventually, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel. But if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than what one was preached to you, let them be under God's curse, as we have already said. So now I say it again, if anyone is preached to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse. Am I trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. This is an example of Christ not being preached. In Galatians, he actually is like calling down curses to anybody who preaches different ones than that. And he calls them deserters of the faith. He's not saying, gee guys, you're doing a really good job over there. I am happy for you. Keep on keeping on. He is not rejoicing here. This is much different than what he says that he has joy for Christ in Philippians. Very different. So let me compare the two, Galatians and Philippians. In Galatians, Paul calls them deserters, that you live by a different gospel that is no gospel at all, and you're perverting it. And if someone tells you that, curse be on them. It's like, these are pretty harsh words. Where in Philippians, he says this. Paul says they are preaching Christ, not once, twice, but 3 times. Not a different gospel, that's not a real gospel. Listen to this is important. So he says in verse 15, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, and 17 preach Christ out of selfish ambition, but in verse 18, Christ is preached. So the Philippians, they have the same beliefs as Paul, or these people that he's talking about. They aren't following other teachers that aren't Jesus. They're not preaching a different gospel that's not a real gospel at all. They're not the deserters of the faith. They're not confused about it or perverting it. These people are actually preaching Christ, so they have the same theology as Paul. And this is a good thing, and we should all be striving for it. So we want to be the people that put on our reading glasses, and we should be studying the Bible because knowing the correct theology is so important. But they do have some things that they're not doing ideally. They're a bit off. So now that's where we get into those 2 people groups within the Philippians book that we're writing. So, reading. So even though the Philippians aren't getting a curse called on them, which is very good, there are still improvements that need to be made. So envy and rivalry. So when you think of envy, you kind of think of jealousy. I think of and I'm like jealous of someone, I'm like looking, I'm like, okay, they got a fancy car, or fancy truck, or a bunch of money, or a big house, or they're attractive, or charismatic, or some other woo thing. But it's interesting that these guys were actually jealous of the ministry that Paul had because he was advancing the gospel. And when you look at this, and you can tell he's advancing the gospel in 2 places that he talks about in Philippians, even though he's in jail. So that's Philippians 1:12 and Philippians 4:22. So he talks about advancing the gospel even though he's in jail. And you can see it through Paul's ministry in prison, that he still has a ministry even though he's in prison. And it says in Philippians 4:22, all God's people here send you greetings, especially those who belong to Caesar's household. So that means there are people in Caesar's household that were saved because of Paul coming there, going there. And that's why he says advancing the gospel. People all around them were being saved, whether the jailers, people in the house, Caesar's household, just around in general. And he finds great joy in this. And he finds so much joy in this because even though he's in prison, the gospel's being preached, the gospel's being known, and it's not about his wealth or status. So I'm going to bring it back into another 2022, present day, and you look at some great preachers. So you look at some people around that are like really get you fired up. So you like listen to Chris and you're like, oh man, I'm all excited. Okay, let's go. Or you listen to Billy Graham's old sermons and you just see people going up in waves of people. And man, I want to get saved all over again listening to him. Or you hear Ken preach. And when Ken preaches and prays for people, he lays hands on people and people cry. And it's like, man, I want people to cry when I lay hands on them. No, I'm just kidding. I don't want to punch. But you know what I mean? Like you can get jealous of these. And if you get jealous of, like, say, Chris or Mr. Graham or Ken, that's where the problem comes. And so you may have the same theology of them, but if you try to become the people that you aren't, and try to get the results they're getting based on even though God's called you to your own ministry, or you're going to have that's where the problem comes. We all have a race to run. We all have our part to play. And I remember Ken saying last week, he said this, he said, if he listened, he read a lot of books about this great worker that performed a lot of miracles. He's like, man, I'm going to try to be like him. And he just lost his joy because of it, because it's not about being one of those people in the past. It's about being who you're called to be now to the best of your ability in following us. The next type, so there's envy, and then there's also rivalry. Well, this one is even crazier to me. They're preaching Christ so that they could take Paul's ministry, so that they're like, Paul's like a great minister, even though he's in jail. It's like they want to take his ministry. It's like, okay, I mean, that doesn't seem like the prestige that people would want, but I guess that's what they were going after. And they're stirring up trouble. It's like, this guy's already been arrested, beaten, and put in shipwrecked. He's now in jail. And then it's like, well, now he's going to stir up a bit more trouble for this guy. It's like, what are you doing? So it's like, that would be like if I come up here and I'm like, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to preach, and I'm going to give it my all so that I can take Brian's job. It's like, no, Dad, no, or cut him down or make it harder for him. It's like, what? We're a team here. That one's just wild to me. And it's like, preaching out of rivalry makes it more about yourself than it does about glorifying God. And that is where we want to be. That's what we want to strive for. So, yeah, we want to go for that. But there were the people that were preaching out of goodwill. So I do want to highlight those guys too, because they're very important. That's where we want to strive for. So they're preaching out of love and goodwill. They're preaching to glorify God. They're preaching out of love for Christ. They would support him when they can. And it strengthened them to see what Paul went through. They're preaching with the gospel without fear. And he is very thankful about it, kind of like what Nathan was what we were talking about in the prayer, is that he was thankful for those people. And people became more confident to do so. Because if you're looking at someone in jail and you're like, you know what, that guy's in jail and he can still find the joy of the Lord, then in our situations we should be able to too. So kind of conclude, but I kind of want to just point out the things that I think were kind of important in these 5 verses. So, it's about make your life about Jesus. You want to do that because when you go through those hard times, it'll strengthen others and it'll build up them, and you'll have the joy of the Lord there too. Because there was hard times, so many were encouraged from Paul, even though there were those hard times. And it encouraged so many people then as it does now. And it made them bold. And when you see successes from other people, man, you want to be happy for them. You want to like encourage them, build them up. Like trying to take the glory for yourself is not what this Christian faith is about. It's about sending it upwards. God has called us all to have our own race to run. And if we're all doing our own race to the best of our ability, we will run so much faster as a church. And even if he calls you to another nation and you don't get to go right away, or it may be in Paul's case, he might not have ever even made it to Spain, that doesn't mean that you're not out of God's will. He just might take you on a different adventure. So I like the ending it says again, I rejoice, yes, and I will continue to rejoice. So let me pray. So Father in heaven, thank you for today. Thank you for letting us gather here, and I pray that as the weeks come that you can give people a clear picture on what you want them to do, where you want them to be, how you want them to be built in, and get us all working together so that machine can just run so much better together and build us up. And I pray that we can glorify you in all that we do. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Awesome.